Oh, that's too dark. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, we still got 1 minute. Sit tight for a sec. Okay. Ooh, that's too loud. 94. Jeez. Guy before me must have a really quiet voice. Okay. Well, welcome back. Okay. Let me just see if I have anything to tell you here that's important. Still working through exams. I may not make my week and a half Wednesday deadline that I set for myself, which was always probably a little bit unrealistic. I'm going to hammer on it tomorrow, well, the rest of today, tomorrow, and Wednesday as I have time. I think I'm about a third of the way through it. My TA, I need to go see why she has yet to thoroughly engage with the marketing process. I know she said she was busy, but this is what she's getting paid for, so I have to go boot her in the pants a little bit. And that'll be okay, and hopefully speed up the process just a little bit. But yeah, about a third of the way through. I was supposed to have more time to work on it today, but then my son called during my first class that he had a headache and needed to be taken home. So I had to leave and then come back and all this stuff. So I didn't get quite as much time to work on it as I wanted, but I'll keep working on that, and hopefully we'll get that done for you sometime this week and get the grades up and all that jazz. Okay. Excuse me. All right. So we're obviously in the work unit, and we are talking about specifically some of the Gen Z struggles. And we ended off, I guess, on Friday on this slide, and I was going to talk about productivity, but we were out of time, so instead we left. All right, so we were talking about kind of these 3 points, right? And this is sort of predictions, and this is largely, I think, consistent with supply side economics and basic kind of assumptions about labor markets. But the assumption has been that, things as the boomers, this really, really large generational cohort, exits the workforce, right? It'll open space up at the middle and top tiers of the workforce. So your older kind of workers now, the Gen Xers and millennials, are going to move up, creating a lot of space for Gen Z at the bottom of the market. That's what should happen, right? So entry-level jobs of all kinds should be widely available to young workers. Because millennials and Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z are all relatively smaller cohorts as compared to the exiting boomers, right? The exit of the boomers should create degrees of labor shortages, meaning we should see rises in wages for young workers and more incentives, right? More competition for workers in the marketplace, because that's how markets work. And because, when there's labor shortages, one of the things that companies generally spend money on is on productivity, right? Basically working on ways to get more output out of the same number or fewer workers, so increasing how much one worker can produce. And this is usually done through technology, machinery, computer programs, all sorts of things, right, to make people more productive. Okay, now, none of these things, and then we ended off with this, rather depressing point, and then, I get told I'm micro-dosing depression every class. I'm sorry about that. None of these things have happened in Canada, right? Youth unemployment remains really quite high, around 20% right now. which is, it's more than twice the rate of unemployment in the general population. Youth wages are rising, but much slower than those of older workers and the rate of inflation. And we saw that, right, if we go back to this chart, right, the gap between older workers and younger workers is getting bigger. And Canadian productivity, and we'll talk about this today, has lagged the US in particular, but Canada is, according to OECD estimates, will be in the kind of lowest quartile of increases in or productivity growth in kind of your most developed economies. $25 an hour at McDonald's. What's the point of your degree? All right, so here's what's really interesting about this, and I think this is an interesting kind of point. Imagine, though, what the people who had degrees, so this obviously McDonald's is no longer paying $25 an hour, right? Because there's no longer really a labor shortage. We're going to talk about that. But in the mid-2010s, right, when there was a labor shortage, if you're getting paid $25 an hour at McDonald's, imagine what you're getting paid other places, right? Other parts of the market that are more skilled. Because McDonald's is really quite low skilled. So if you're an entry-level worker, say in business or engineering or nursing, right, and your comparative is, well, people at McDonald's are getting paid $25 an hour, that's going to do something, right, to the overall wages. Bless you. And so, rising wages at the bottom tier, right, that bottom quarter of the job market, generally mean rising wages across the board. So you can expect much higher wages in more skilled parts of the market, right? And that would shrink some of those gaps between, older workers and younger workers, but also would tend to decrease inequality, right? Because what would businesses have to do? Well, in order to keep functioning and making some money, they have to pay workers more, right? Which would reduce profits, potentially, but would also mean that the gap between, income inequality would be much better. So your degree still has a ton of a point, right? You should have a degree, right? And I showed you, all of these fancy graphs, right? Like you're going to do way better in terms of employment, right? In terms of what kind of job you have, your employability, this one, right? Average hourly wages, the more education you have, you're still going to outperform other job categories. It's just that it's going to be much higher in real terms. Okay. Sorry, I'm doing the thing where I click through too many slides and then I give everyone an epileptic seizure in the middle of a lecture. Okay. So, productivity. And I wanted to take a second because, sometimes these words just fly through and people don't define terms, and I'm guilty of this as well. But why is productivity particularly important, right? Like, who cares, production per worker? So generally speaking, economic productivity is one of the critical factors in determining standard of living. The higher a level of productivity, the higher standard of living in a country, right? So, for one, it measures things like, let me get my highlighter out, the efficiency with which goods and services are produced. Higher productivity leads to more output and consumption for the same amount of work. Okay, so for the same amount of work, you get more products and more services, right? Okay, so this results in all sorts of things. Higher wages, okay? Because you're producing more, right, per worker, workers get compensated better, right? Especially those that are more skilled. And that lets you, command better compensation and improved living standards. I mean, among other things, right, if productivity rises really sharply, if you're producing the same or more per hour as you were in the past, in a lot of cases, this translates to people having to work fewer hours, right? If you're more productive, right, you can hit quotas, you can hit, all sorts of levels of production, all that faster. And so work weeks might be shorter, people might get longer vacation periods and compensations as profits rise and all of that fun stuff. Okay. Now, key to productivity growth is generally linked to economic growth, right? A more productive economy makes more stuff. There's more disposable income, more consumption, all of that. So you get more economic growth, which contributes to a higher GDP per capita, right? This is a pretty abstract number, right? If you take the gross domestic product of a country and you divide it by the number of working people or by the number of citizens, right? You get GDP per capita. But generally speaking, a higher GDP per capita means higher living standards because you can afford more stuff, right? Nicer homes, more cars, more vacations, more stuff, more computers, more smartphones, all of that jazz. So there's more consumption. There's more, excuse me. My voice has decided to die. All right. Try that. I'm sorry I coughed into the microphone. Right, so GDP per capita, if it rises, right, we get better living standards in general. Okay, so why has this kind of gone sideways, right? So why haven't we seen these three predictions that are here? Why has this not occurred? Okay, so the first one, and here I want to be really careful, and I want to use really careful language, because I'm going to talk a little bit about Canada's temporary foreign worker program and the way it sort of distorts the labor market. Now, I want to be really clear about this because I don't think, the people to blame is the temporary foreign workers, right? There can be a tendency in these discourses to blame, people coming and, from poorer parts of the world and, quote unquote, taking Canadian jobs. And that's not the case I want to make here at all. I think when we look at temporary foreign workers, the people coming over largely are reacting to very rational economic incentives, right? Standards of living in Canada are much higher than they are in most of the places temporary foreign workers come from. Coming to Canada and working in this market allows them to send remittances back home, to help relatives and children and all sorts of things like that. So they're reacting to, conditions created in Canada, and they're reacting rationally to it. The problem, more or less, is the system itself, which I think, you can make a really, really strong case, and several very policy-oriented people have made the case that this program fundamentally is broken and probably doesn't serve temporary foreign workers very well, and certainly doesn't serve Canadian young people very well either. Okay, so point number one, right? And that was, if you recall, DS's point number one is the baby boomers are retiring, and that should lead to labor shortages, right? Labor shortage. So why has that not happened? Well, in general, this seems to have not happened largely because of what's called the temporary foreign worker program. Right? This program's been around for a while. It really sort of gained prominence in the Harper years, right, under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, so through the 2000s. But the genesis of the program as it is today largely owes its existence to the post-2015 government in Canada, and that would be the Liberals under Justin Trudeau and my buddy. If you know me, you know I love him. Justin Trudeau, right? Not at all the least competent person to ever have been Prime Minister of Canada. Okay, so what is the temporary foreign worker program? Basically, the temporary foreign worker program allows companies to apply to bring in workers from abroad, right? So there's a few caveats on it. Basically, they have to prove that there is no worker in Canada that is willing to do the job. So jobs have to be posted. And after that, they apply for what's called a labor market impact assessment, or, labor market impact assessment, a LMIA. And then, they can bring over a temporary foreign worker to fill a position in Canada. This program, as it was conceived under the Harper government, was largely conceived to help companies bring in highly skilled workers where they couldn't find highly skilled workers for positions in the Canadian market, right? If you need a particular kind of engineer or doctors or nurses, right, to bring in those really skilled workers that you didn't have a big enough supply of in Canada, we wanted to bring those in. and kind of fill those labor gaps. So that was the way the program was initially conceived of. However, what happens in the Trudeau years, right, that kind of 9.5 to 10 years of the Trudeau government, is this program really transforms, and it becomes, right, and especially post-2020, basically a massive pool of really cheap labor, largely in the low-skilled category, right? And so, the stereotype now of the temporary foreign worker is someone working in retail or food services, typically fast food, right? And since 2020, the majority of TFWs actually have come into our lower skilled occupations. And it's something like low skilled workers, tend to be low productivity, right? Because there's only so many burgers that you can flip. And about 66% of TFWs in Canada today are in that low skilled category. And it's really hard to tell because the federal government has also done a really, really terrible job of keeping track of their numbers. But there's somewhere between 845,000 and potentially up to 2 million temporary foreign workers in Canada today. Okay, so that's fun. So what does that all do, right? Well, so that's our point from Diaz. On our kind of second point, right? So that is, if I go back to Diaz, where was my points from Diaz? I lost my slide. Oh, right here, right? So point number 2, labor shortages should mean rising wages. There we go. It's pretty clear at this point, and economists have more or less admitted as much, that TFWs have largely been in service, increasingly, and especially these low-skilled ones, in service of the profits of really large corporations, right? Who are now employing the bulk of temporary foreign workers outside of the agriculture category. And agriculture is a very particular category where temporary foreign workers are much more likely to come work in agriculture during harvest and leave because there's no work for them, right? So outside of agriculture, which again is fairly low skilled, but outside of agriculture, it's largely been people employed in low skill service work. You see the jump in the share, right, of temporary foreign workers working in food services went from 34% to 40 in 2011 to 42% in 2021, and has continued to rise. And yes, as goes to this point that this person made here, right? Temporary foreign workers, and maybe I'll look at your comment very quickly here. There are agencies that import individuals for the TFW program, taking their passport, garnishing their wages, amongst other atrocities. Yay, Canada, right? This is 100% right. So TFW rules are really weird, and they are designed in such a way as to be very advantageous to employers and very disadvantageous to temporary foreign workers. So amongst other things, if you come in as a temporary foreign worker, and let's say you're working at Tim Hortons, though I don't want to single out Tim Hortons because they are, not by any means any worse than any other company, right? You see this at McDonald's, Burger King, Subway, right? It's all over the place in the food services industry. It is absolutely everywhere. It is pretty much endemic. If you were brought in on a labor market impact assessment, you cannot leave that job, right? If you leave that job, you will be unable to get another one, right? Because you were brought in specifically and your work permit is only for that job. So you're tied to that job. So you're unable to leave. You're very much tied to that job, and employers know it. And there has been a ton of unscrupulous behavior that's really well documented around TFWs. Things like, part of the agreement that they make with the person is that, sometimes people are actually paying, immigration consultants for that labor market impact assessment. So they may be putting themselves and their families into debt in their countries of origin. This is a really, really common thing. And back a couple of years ago, the average cost of getting a labor market impact assessment, was in the range of about $40,000 Canadian. Right now, again, that's not that's a lot of money. That's a fairly nice car. It's not a crazy amount of money by Canadian standards. Maybe my standards have changed over time. It's a lot of money, but imagine someone from, say, India or the Philippines, right? That is them, borrowing as much money as they can to get someone over. So that is a lot of money. They're often paying for the privilege of being a temporary foreign worker, which is a little crazy and also pretty illegal, but it's a pretty unregulated system by all measures. They also often have to live in a house that's owned by the business, right? So franchise owners at places like McDonald's and Tim Hortons have often owned real estate and been, had houses that they had maybe 10 to 30 temporary foreign workers living in, and often like sleeping in shifts, right? So you're going to go to work at my McDonald's from this time, and then you'll sleep, and then the other person that was sleeping before is going to go work the night shift. That's been pretty common as well. And they can't leave, right? They're sort of stuck in this pattern. And I love this one. An independent UN human rights expert described the system as a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery, right? So not good. Now, I will just say, again, a lot of temporary foreign workers are women, and a lot of those women have also faced, sexual assault and exploitation by the people that brought them in. Now, again, I'm sure there's good temporary foreign worker bosses. I'm sure they're not all like that. There's enough of it that it's definitely problematic. So bad on that end. Now, the worst thing, and again, for young workers, so it's bad for, I think, temporary foreign workers. Oh, I should mention one other thing. One of the things that had been sort of promised by the TFW program is that it would allow people to transition into permanent residency. And that has been not as true as I think people would like it to be, right? So a lot of people were promised that come and work at Tim Hortons or McDonald's or wherever for 2 years, and you'll get on the permanent resident track to eventually become a permanent resident of Canada, at which point you can leave the TFW program, get other jobs, and all of that fun stuff. It doesn't always happen, though. Okay. Now, in economics terms, right, the use of this program has allowed businesses to bring in huge pools of foreign labor that basically has put downward pressure on Canadian wages, right? Especially for the least skilled and experienced workers in the pool, right? And this is a simple supply and demand argument, right? So you increase supply, right? And basically you drop prices. Like any commodity, right? Labor is a commodity like any other. It operates in a marketplace. So if you increase supply, you reduce price. So it's been harder for young workers to command a lot of, any kind of price for their labor because there's so much competition in the marketplace. And, oh, thank God. Last time that happened, my laptop would not display anything for like an hour afterwards. Oh, you scared me. Don't do that to me. We're not friends, me and my Dell. We are enemies, but I need it to work because I didn't bring my other laptop today. Okay. Okay. I mean, generally speaking, I don't know if I have these stats here. Oh, I do. In a second. All right, we'll get back to this. Okay, let's keep going. So our number 3, right, when we talk about productivity, Canadian productivity also, along with this flooding of the labor supply, has continued to stagnate. And right, you see this is our OECD numbers from 2021. And where do we see the expected productivity of Canada between our productivity growth between 2020 and 2030? Well, we're in the bottom quartile, right? So low productivity growth. We're along with Greece. Never want to be along with Greece economically. Italy, long a laggard economically for lots of reasons. Japan, which has been stuck in a 2-decade stagnation, right, with very little productivity growth. And then the Luxembourg, which weirdly is low productivity but incredibly rich. And then, the UK, which is essentially deindustrializing, and Mexico, right, which is lots of economic and social and political problems in Mexico that slow down productivity growth. Also has a really cheap labor supply. Okay, so Canadian productivity is in the bottom quartile, right? We are in bad shape that way. And again, if you look at the places above us, these are all countries largely deindustrializing. So, bad. You don't want to be in that category. Where's the United States, by the way? Our friend, I guess, kind of. Not really. They're right here, right? They're kind of in the bottom part of that second quartile, but outperforming us. And we're well below the OECD average and getting our butts kicked by, Hungary, Korea, Slovenia, Costa Rica, Estonia, Latvia, all these fun places. Okay, so we're not doing great in terms of productivity growth. So what is driving low Canadian productivity growth? Well, for one, it's that TFW program, right? An over-reliance on low-skilled workers. Low-skilled workers, just importing a really large pool of low-skilled workers is considerably cheaper than invest in the short term than investing in things that would increase productivity. Okay, so that's one, right? If you have a labor pool of cheap workers, you're going to get low productivity. Now, the other one, and these are going to kind of, and I'm sure you're aware, because this has made your lives really difficult in lots of ways. We've had, in Canada, really from the early 2000s all the way to, a couple of years ago when inflation really started to bite, essentially a very long policy in Canada of keeping interest rates very, very low, near zero, right? So they never were quite zero. I think the lowest they got, during kind of the trough of COVID is like interest rates, like I can't remember on the bond yields, but it was really low. It was about 2%, right? Actually, it was a little bit lower than that on like the, we were talking like 1.5% interest rates, and people were able to borrow money, especially on things like mortgages, really, really, really cheap. My wife and I upgraded our house during COVID, and I think we tacked in at an interest rate that was like 1.79%. I missed that interest rate. It just went up in October, and it's much more expensive now. Okay, so what does this do? Well, it basically incentivizes people with money, right? Capital holders to invest largely in non-productive industries. And in Canada, the biggest of these has been housing, right? So what's happened in Canada really since the 2000s is that virtually all the investment money has gone into one sector, right? And that sector is housing. Because what happened with these really low interest rates, right? So when I was able to get, we didn't do this because we're not stupid, a 1.8% interest rate, the incentive is to spend more on housing than you otherwise might, right? Because let's say the house is listed at 400,000, but suddenly you get into a bit, like you're in Toronto or Vancouver or somewhere like that. Okay, I know a $400,000 house in Vancouver is a bit of a fiction, but let's go with it because I already wrote the number down and I don't want to put a 1 in front of it. I guess I could. A $1.4 million one-bedroom house in Vancouver, right? Not a fiction. Okay, well, what might you do though? And let's take the 1 out. We'll just go with the 400,000. Suddenly there's a bidding war, right? There's you and 3 other people bidding on the house, and you know that you can borrow money very cheaply. So you're like, okay, my next offer is 450,000, right? You just tack on an extra $50,000 onto the price because you're borrowing it very, very cheap. So what this does over time, right, as you have, not enough housing supply, people borrowing money really cheaply, so they drive up the price of housing because they make emotional decisions, not rational market-based ones. And capital holders invest a lot as well, right, in condos and all of these sorts of things, is you get increasingly the price of housing goes up, and it looks like a really good investment, right? So then people do crazy things like take out home equity lines of credit and use it to buy an investment property as a rental, right? Further constraining housing supply and further driving up prices. So a lot of capital in Canada has been tied up in housing, right? Now, housing, everybody needs a house, but it is, from an economic perspective, a non-productive asset, right? Once that house is sitting there, it doesn't do anything, right? As opposed to if you bought like machinery to build something, right? To dig something, to build better windows in your factory that builds windows in Kelowna or whatever. That's a weird example. My friend owns a window factory in Kelowna and just invested a bunch of money in new machinery to take his staff down from 30 to about 8. And so I have this window idea in my head, right? But per worker, that's much more efficient. He's making much more profit, and he might open a second window factory in Ontario. That's his plan, right? With all the money he's making on windows. So we get a lot of investment in housing that soaks up a lot of the capital that could be invested in productive things, and housing itself is non-productive, right? It doesn't make anything. Once it's there, it's just kind of there. Okay, so tack that on with high population growth driven largely by a pretty loosey-goosey immigration policy that includes a lot of TFWs. And what we've had is just an explosion in housing prices, overinvestment, which has driven both low productivity and high housing prices. And I don't want to tell you how to feel. What I've mostly heard from Gen Z is, they've sort of already given up on owning a home. In a lot of cases, my daughter's plan at the moment is just to live at home forever until we die and then take it over, which, I hope she's not planning anything, but maybe. Okay, right, so this is all bad news, right? Poor productivity growth, so worse standard of living, lower GDP per capita, too much money tied up in housing, all bad for Gen Z. Okay, and now that I've microdosed your depression, what can I do?
Forgive me, I'm not an economics major. I have no idea what I'm talking about, but I had to look it up. And the UAE uses a lot of genuine
slave labor. Yes.
I looked it up, and they're one of the top economic projected growth points. Is that just because they're doing actually productive things?
Yeah, the way that they've invested in things is a little bit more productive. The other thing with the UAE is it starts from a really low place, right? A pretty unproductive, low economy. And so a lot of that is imaginary. They also don't measure things like GDP per capita to include all of their slave labor, right? It's only Emirati citizens. And I think all of that transient labor is mostly from Africa and from India. And they don't technically count as population. So they don't count them. Like your GDP per capita there could jump up. And how should we put this? I don't want to suggest anything. Slaves, in a sense, can be quite economically productive in the short term because you can extract a lot of value at a relatively low cost, right? It doesn't tend to be a good strategy over the long term. Not just for moral reasons, but eventually, non-slaves tend to work harder than slaves do. And I guess the UAE technically isn't actual slavery. It's just like virtual slavery where they take your passport and, maybe work you to death building their soccer stadium for the World Cup or something like that. But yeah, the way the UAE is counted, and also, their economy starts from a really small place. And so that raw GDP growth makes it look more productive than it actually is. But it's a great question. Okay. No, a wonderful question. Okay. So why do they microduce depression, but benevolent? Okay, that's getting worse. I liked stern better. Okay, why do companies prefer hiring TFWs over Canadians? I assume they still have to pay minimum wage. Okay, so some of that is the double dipping, right? When you can rent them a house too, right, and double dip income, right? So imagine paying someone minimum wage, but then they pay you back $500 or $700 or $900 of that in rent, right? That's part of it. Again, part of these, some of these companies are getting through these immigration consultants, part of that $40,000 payment that I was talking about, or more, right, or less. So to get that labor market impact assessment, right? A company actually has to post a job and act like nobody actually applied for it, or they couldn't find anyone who had the skills to do it. So they get sometimes part of that payment. And again, $20,000, say, might not be much for one worker, but imagine that over hundreds of workers, right? That kind of money adds up. So there's a lot of shady under the table kind of dealings that go on that way. Franchise owners for a lot of fast food restaurants are notoriously getting these kinds of payments, right? And I mean, if they get caught, they won't be able to file any more labor market impact assessments, but the number of them getting caught is relatively low. And sometimes, there's ways that they don't pay minimum wage or post positions, at lower wages than they actually pay the workers, and the workers just kind of go along with it. So, there's lots of ways that this goes wrong and it's exploitative. I think it's pretty universally acknowledged that it's exploitative, but it's been a hard system to get out of. Okay, I got 2 more slides on this, and we'll move on to microdosing some other depression. Or macro. I think we're just in macrodosing depression at this point. We're not even microdosing it. Okay. This is another perspective, right? This is from an immigration lawyer based in Alberta. It's time to change colors again. He talked to CBC Radio's The House on the TFW program. And he said, it requires employers to prove there's no Canadian available to do the job and that they're paying the prevailing wage rate. Now, this is a system that's been, so one of the things that's happened, and the reason I think, Mark Holt, to be honest, is a little bit self-interested here. I was going to use a worse word, but let's say self-interested, because he's an immigration lawyer, so this is his business. There's a lot of ways that companies have manipulated this, right? Posting it in places that people aren't looking, not posting it widely publicly enough, not for long enough periods, right? Posting it, taking it down, posting it again, and pretending that that's an actual posting, and they're paying the prevailing wage rate. As you do more of this, you drive down the prevailing wage rate. And he says it's not designed to put downward pressure on wages. I'm not an economist, but I know a few, and I'm pretty sure it does. Okay, now what he says, it's not really TFW's fault. It's all the fault of international students, right? I think those are probably not his customers, if I'm guessing. Who can obtain open work permits after graduation that can be valid up to 3 years. And I love his quote. Yeah, you can have someone say, yes, I will work as the manager of your restaurant and I will work for minimum wage, when then employers will pay minimum wage, right? There's no check and balance on that. So again, I'm sure that's true, and we certainly have seen that the international student programs, especially in Ontario, have been widely abused. For the same, scam colleges bringing people in to do like a 1-year diploma that is basically a pay-for-play diploma. And then, you pay, you get the diploma, but it's basically worthless in the market. It's a way of getting people in, immigrating through the back door. Let me put it this way. According to the federal data, more than 1 million people had valid permits to study at a Canadian university or cégep in Quebec in September 2024. Meanwhile, a report from Digital Day said Canada's decision to relax work restrictions for non-permanent residents allowed international students to work more than 20 hours per week during the pandemic, right? Which led to a sharp increase in that category of workers, in the 20 to 24-year-old kind of international student work. Okay, so as the pandemic moved into the rearview mirror and economic activity normalized, the deluge of available labor outpaced demand, putting upward pressure on youth unemployment rates. And that's exactly what's happened. Do TFWs have to pay taxes? They do, right? They even have to pay things like CPP. So, Canada Pension, though largely, and this sucks for them too, they will never get to collect it because, most of them will not work in Canada long enough to actually collect CPP. But yes, they do have to pay taxes. Okay, so government policy on this. The old rules under Harper, right, in that those heady days, I don't want to say nice things about Stephen Harper, but, those heady days under Stephen Harper said that if local unemployment was over 6%, it was impossible to get a low labor market impact assessment to bring in a temporary foreign worker. And the Trudeau Liberals, in their infinite wisdom, removed that requirement in 2022. So now we have, national unemployment. This was last semester. It may have shifted now. I didn't check it today. At 6.9%, somewhere in the high sevens for Alberta, 7.9% in Ontario. And yet, government has slowed down now under Mark Carney, alumnus of St. Francis Xavier High School here in Edmonton. So it has slowed down a little bit. They're slowing this down a bit, but still have this program in place, and there's still companies applying for labor market impact assessments. Okay, so the changes that the Liberals announced in April 2022 also allowed companies to raise the percent of foreign workers they were using from 10 to 20%, and in some cases 30% of their workforces, right? So that's a lot of temporary foreign workers. And I love this is in this article here. You can go find it on Yahoo News if you copy that in. It's a quote from Mark Carney, right? When I talk to businesses around the country, their number one issue is tariffs, right? Everybody's worried about tariffs. And their number two issue is access to temporary foreign workers. Again, I think we get largely from that quote. And I mean, this is no discredit to Mr. Carney. Companies, they've driven their corporate profits a lot using temporary foreign workers, and they want to continue doing so. Okay. Okay, I thought that was a hand up. Never mind. I'm good. Have I made you feel sad enough today? Okay, so that's it, on that kind of note, and I'll move on to something else in a second here. But I will say, right, generally speaking, and this is true, Canada's youth unemployment rate has sat over 2 times the rate of national unemployment, right? So like this 6.9% rate, the most recent numbers in Canada is about 20% youth unemployment, right? And young people are the ones most hurt by these policies, right, of low productivity and flooding the labor market with cheap labor, because it takes away those entry-level positions that young people might get that first kind of leg up and that first experience doing, right? And so, it's a concerted effort, I think, by businesses in this country to increase their profits by keeping their costs really, really low. And temporary foreign workers are just a tool in that bundle. Keeps productivity low, and it's largely, allowed the government, if I want to talk Trudeau government, to pretend that Canada had robust GDP growth, because all of those people that were brought in do things like consume, right? They buy cars, they buy clothes, they buy more food, so it's also increased the price of all of those things, housing, and so all of that extra population put a whole bunch of extra pressure on things like educational institutions, schools, because some of them brought their kids over when they came over as temporary foreign workers too, hospitals, the general healthcare system. It's all been kind of put under pressure. And the government sort of patched this over by saying like, oh, well, we have robust GDP growth in Canada, but was largely just driven by consumption, not by actual gains in productivity. So Canada's fallen well behind the pack, right? Where's Canada in the pack of, productivity levels in the OECD? Kind of in the middle, right? Nowhere near, say, the United States or, the Irish. Man, the Irish have high productivity growth or high productivity. All good. Okay, so when we talk about youth unemployment, we're generally talking between 15 and 24, right? Although some people will expand that all the way to kind of like 28, 29. That's where we're looking at it, just because, coming out of school, you're kind of like 22, 23 for the most part, which means a lot of young people are trying to get their first career type jobs at that point, right? Or trying to get that first experience. Okay. Oh, depression. All right, let's be fun. I only have a couple slides left here. I'm sorry. Let's talk about harassment in the workplace, and that'll take us nearly to the end of the class. Okay, so on a totally different subject, like harsh left turn, let's talk a little bit about what the workplace looks like, especially in terms of kind of things like harassment. Okay, so despite, I'm going to assume that's not important. There's no name attached to it, and it says Sherwood Park, so that can't be useful. All right, my son's already at home. He's probably not calling me. Oh, they did leave me a voicemail. How fun. All right, despite the increase in laws governing things like sexual harassment, and this is mostly, down to kind of women. This slide mostly has to do with women's experience of the workplace. Things like harassment, continue to be a big problem for women at work. Basically, 87% of women will report some type of sexual harassment in the workplace during their working careers. Now, there's different types, of course, and it depends on what part of the economy you're in, right? For women who are working in, say, food services, retail, things like childcare, some of this will come from customers, right? There's pretty rampant, sexual harassment by customers in the workplace. In other cases, and more often in more professionalized settings, that harassment is coming largely from superiors, right? Though again, it's not impossible to be sexually harassed in kind of that lower tier of the service sector by superiors either. Okay, we can roughly class our two types of harassment that people tend to experience in the workplace as either quid pro quo or what's called a poisoned or toxic work environment. Okay, so quid pro quo. Basically, it's a Latin phrase that essentially denotes some form of exchange, right? This for that, essentially. And this is where sex is exchanged or demanded for continued employment, advancement, hiring, or what have you, right? So this is, a boss, saying, well, I'll give you that big promotion if you sleep with me, or something like that, right? And while it's tacky and terrible, it certainly happens, and probably more than we think it does. I know when I worked at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, which again, please never work there. If you have any standards or you value anything, it may be better now. I don't know. It's been like over a decade since I worked there. I guess, when did I quit? 2008. So yeah, it's been a long time, almost 2 decades. Shit. I'm old. What the hell? How did that happen? But, a lot of the women that I worked with complained that, they were brought in for interviews, and the bosses were like, well, I'm not sure that you're right for the position, but, if you meet me in room XXX of this hotel tonight, maybe we could discuss it further. And the implications were pretty, pretty well understood by those people. So, it still happens, or it was happening 20 years ago. I can't believe it's been 20 years, almost. But yeah. Okay, the other one, and very common, is what's called a poisoned work environment, which is where the work environment is sexualized in some way, right? Either, it can be lots of things, jokes, catcalling, pet names, or nicknames for someone that denotes something sexual, anything that would make someone uncomfortable about the environment they work in. Okay, and for women, and again, I think this will surprise no one, work is frequently sexualized, and attractiveness is frequently used as a quality that is judged for hiring and advancement. Now, some of this is like mundane, in the service industry, right? You go to certain restaurant chains, I won't name which ones because I think you all know, and the waitresses are exceptionally attractive and, shall we say, scantily dressed. And it was, so I had a friend, and at the time they were working at Moxie's, and I don't know if Moxie's is still like this because I haven't been to a Moxie's probably in longer than I haven't worked at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, because who cares? But they were, the hostess at Moxie's, and at the time people would come in and hand in their resume, looking for a job, and the manager, male, I don't know if that's pertinent, had told her to write on the resume, if the person was attractive and Moxie's material, nothing. But if they were less attractive and not Moxie's material, he wanted her to just put 110 on the top of the resume in pen. And she explained to me that if you connect the two ones in 110, it makes the word no, right? Not attractive enough to work there. Okay, that's the mundane level. My friends have lived traumatic lives, by the way. I have another friend, right? And I will say, very attractive lady, and she is an engineer. And when she was working at a really large oil company, right, they were trying to land some deal with another oil company. And she was told that she was being brought along to the meeting, though she was a junior engineer, because, the boss at the other oil company had taken a liking to her, and she was told, could you dress nice? I mean, like, you know, really nice. If you kind of get what that means, right? She was being asked to, you know, short skirt, show some cleavage, you know, look really pretty for this interview. She didn't, and I will say she got laid off 2 months later. So, you know, she's doing fine. Don't worry about her. She has a very nice career at this point, where she is now the boss and doesn't have to, you know, do anything she doesn't want to do. So this happens all over, and like I said, at the very bottom tier of the service industry, right, in food services, waitressing, that kind of thing, and up in, you know, engineering and all of those kinds of places. Have I microdosed enough depression for today? Okay. Well, we'll leave it there. I'm out of time anyway. I can't do any more. All right, so let's leave it there. We'll finish up work on Wednesday, and I'll answer this question on Wednesday. I'll answer this question on Wednesday, and we'll continue, and we'll move on to our next unit, which is, I don't remember what, but I'll figure it out. What's that? Families. Oh, that's a fun one. That's 80% less depressing, I think. Turn off the recordings.